Dr. Campbell here, and today I would like to walk you through utilizing the 3M encoder. I'm going to share my screen with you. So for weeks 2 through 7, you are going to be coding 2 inpatient medical records. And in the week 2 live lecture, I will actually cover the process. But for this demonstration, what I would like to do is to use one of the week 2 records, inpatient case number 11, um, for today's demonstration. So in order to get prepared for utilizing the 3M encoder to locate the MSDRG, the very first thing that you must do, and please hear me, this is very important, this will save you a lot of time. You need to read and code the medical record and code it with your physical coding manual. If you try and use the encoder to assign your diagnoses and procedure codes, it's really going to take a long time. And I know you guys' time is very valuable, so I'm going to show you the fastest way possible to do this. Now, obviously, it's not going to be 5 minutes, but it will be faster if you were to use the encoder screens. So, again, the very first thing you want to do is read through your medical record. I recommend printing the medical record and highlighting what you intend to code. As a reminder, for each and every medical record, there are 9 questions that you have to answer. And you have to answer both questions in one post by Wednesday. So it's very important that you work on this sooner than later. Okay, so let's say I've read through the medical record. This one happens to be 26 pages. Printed double side so you can save on paper. Some of the records are going to be old. Some are going to be handwritten. Some are going to be typed. But again, I just recommend that you print them. So let's say you've read through the medical record and you know your admitting diagnoses, code number. You know where your patient was discharged to, because you're going to read that in your medical record. You know what the principal diagnosis is. You're going to apply the guidelines to make that decision. You know what secondary diagnoses apply. You know if there are any significant procedures. And steps 1 through 6 you can do with your physical code book and your resources. And you should do steps 1 through 6 with your physical code book and your resources. But for step 7, which is assign the MSDRG, step 8, the relative weight, you're going to need your coding, your 3M coding system. So I've already logged in to the DeVry lab, and I'm going to launch my 3M encoder. It takes a little while to load up, so we'll give it a second. Okay, so once the 3M screen appears, the very first thing that you need to do is to identify the patient's gender. So I mentioned that I was going to use case number 11 for my example, and so that patient happens to be a female. And then the next thing is to enter the patient's age. And I always just put in 65 for these cases, so you don't have to get caught up in getting the correct age, because these records are actually pretty old. They're like from the 1980s. So a lot of these patients were 80 something when this data service took place. So don't be so concerned with that. Just make sure that the gender is correct, but the age you don't have to worry about. So I'm just going to type in 65. Don't worry about the discharge date. Leave that as is. Do not use the discharge date on the record. Again, leave the discharge date alone. If you change the discharge date, it's going to take you to 1986. And in 1986, we were not using ICD-10, we were using ICD-9. And keep in mind, it is 2016, we're on ICD-10. Okay, so leave the discharge date alone. Under product, you want to change it to the DRG finder. You don't have to touch the system. So on this screen here, I had to make sure that my gender was correct. That's very important. I just typed in 65 years of age. You just use that as your standard age. I'm not going to touch my admit or discharge date. And my product is DRG Finder. Okay, I do not touch the grouper. All of that stays the same. Next, I'm going to hit the continue button. Okay, and so the very first thing that the system asks me is, what is my patient's disposition? In doc sharing, there's actually a list of patient dispositions or discharge status, but in looking at case number 11, this patient actually went home. So I am going to select option number 1. Okay, now this is where it gets very tricky, and this is why it's important for you to use your physical coding manuals as opposed to your using the different screens here, because it will take you so long. So what's going to happen is that the default is enter keyword. What we're going to do to make this process faster, again, you're going to use your physical coding manual to assign your diagnosis codes, okay? So then how we're going to get the diagnosis codes into the system is that we're going to click on code book here. And when I click on code book, an actual code book appears. And what I'm going to do, and let me just kind of give you a little overview of this screen. The left side here is the alphabetical index for diagnoses. The right-hand side is the tabular list. You can change the tabs at the top to reflect what you're looking for. So if you need to use the table of drugs, that's here. If you need to use the external cause to injuries index, that's here. If you need to look up neoplasms, that's here. Procedures, that's here. But I'm just going to do diagnoses codes because in case number 11, that's all we need to do. And again, you are using your physical manuals to assign the codes. Okay, so for this case, you should notice that the system is saying, what is the ICD-10 principal diagnosis? And you know that the principal diagnosis is the condition that's established after study to be chiefly responsible for occasioning the admission of the patient to the hospital. And in this record, case number 11, the care is really directed towards the dehydration. So that's actually going to be my principal diagnosis. So I've coded the dehydration and I've come up with E86.0. So over here on the right-hand side, which is the tabular list, I'm going to type in E86.0 and it pulls up the code for dehydration. Now, in order to get the code from over here in my electronic code book to back over here, all I have to do is click on the code once and an instructional note will come up. This is like the instructional note that you're going to see in the tabular list. they're embedded into this system. So it's going to come up just to let you know about, the excludes one note. So I'm going to say, okay, thank you. And now the screen is showing me that my principal diagnosis is E86.0. Now, one of the requirements for this assignment, let me go back to the course room. So I got my number 3 in, and now for number 4, I got to put in my secondary diagnoses. So once again, I'm going to select code book, and keep in mind, I have already gone through the medical record. I have already decided what my principal diagnosis is, what my secondary diagnosis is, so that I can just enter them over here in the tabular list. So this patient also has gastroenteritis, which I coded as K52.9. Again, I type in my code that I got from my physical code manual. Over here on the right-hand side in the tabular list, my code appears. I click on it. An instructional note is going to appear. And then now you notice it appears as a secondary diagnosis. Well, I got more secondary diagnoses to code, so I'm going to click on Code Book again. And the patient has a laxative abuse, so I'm going to type in that code. Again, it comes up. I click on the code, and an instructional note appears. Now, these instructional notes you should have read in your physical code book. So here we're just using a shortcut to have the system compute our MSDRG for us. But in order to get the system to compute the MSDRG, we had to go through putting in the age, the discharge disposition, and all these diagnoses. Okay, so I'm going to select OK again. And I got another diagnosis, which is the patient has Parkinson's disease. I coded that to G20. And so again, I'm typing it in the tabular list. I'm going to click on G20. An instructional note appears. My code is there. I also coded anemia, which I coded to D64.9. And again, I'm going to click on it. An instructional note appears. I say OK. The patient also has osteoporosis. I'm going to click on my code book again. For that, I coded M80.00X. And one of the things I want to tell you about this electronic code book is that you should notice as I started to type in M80.0 and then the X, my screen at the top here went from green, and when I put the X in, it got to red. That's because this is a code that requires an additional character, and in this particular case, there's a 7th character that's required. So if you notice, my code M80.00, which is listed right here, it has a plus sign behind it. That lets me know that my code is not complete. Just like in your physical code manual, how it has that check 7th character behind it. So I'm going to click on M80.00 because when this plus sign is here, it's going to give you more options to get to your 7th character. So I'm going to click on it here. A window appears, and it wants to know if it's a letter A, if it's a letter D, or if it's a letter G, as well as, let me scroll down some more, a letter K, P, or S. So for this case, I'm using the letter D. If you notice, the code book is putting that placeholder character in for me. So I'm going to click on the M80.00XD, which is the code that I found in my coding manual. And an instructional note appears. And the code appears in the background. Okay, let's see what else I coded. Oh, the patient had an allergy to something. So I'm going to type in that code Z88.2. They were allergic to sulfa. And again, I click on that code, an instructional note appears. And so all of my codes are listed here. Now, if you recall looking at the instructions, your principal diagnoses, your secondary diagnoses have to have a POA indicator. So I'm going to click on POA up here at the top. And then each of my diagnoses codes will appear. And the system wants to know, are these conditions present on admission? So one thing that's very important is to have read your POA guidelines, because the concept of yes, no, no information in the record, which is you, W, the physician doesn't know, or the code is exempt, that information is actually listed in the guidelines. So remember I told you guys to print a physical copy? So on page 105 all the way over to page 115 in your physical code guidelines, that's where you have your POA guidelines. So you have to read those in order to understand which route you are going to go. So I'm going to say yes, for each one that I believe was present on admission. Not sure why the screen was doing that. And my Z code, I'm going to list as exempt per the guidelines. I'm going to select OK. And you'll notice that now each of my codes have a POA indicator in front of them. Okay, so once you're done with your coding, then the next thing you have to do is select Compute DRG. And for this case, the DRG is 641 and the weight is 0.7221. For your coding roundtable, all you have to do now for 7 and 8 is to say, okay, my MSDRG is 641. And then for number 8, which is the relative weight, the CMS weight is 0.7221. And then you have to answer number 9, is there an opportunity to query? And then only then, if you're done with this case, you can then carry out the same steps to get your MSDRG and your weight for case number 39, which is the second case for week number 2. And so all you have to do is select next patient. Now let me just tell you what happens when you select next patient. Your information is gone. So you got to make sure that you are definitely ready to finish the process, because if not, it will erase once you select next patient. Okay, so I hope that was very helpful for you, and I will see you in the week 2 live lecture. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.